Thank you so much for inviting me to take part in this symposium. It's a subject that I'm extremely interested in and one that I think we need to take very seriously. I couldn't agree more with what Professor Koo was saying, particularly the piece about what kind of society do we want our education systems to create. And I think that's really the crux of it. And for quite a while now, I've been focusing very much on how we help people understand more about artificial intelligence, because I think it's super important that we have appropriate regulation to protect people and to help them gain the benefits from AI and avoid the risks. But I think regulation will always be somewhat lagging behind the technology. So it's extremely important that we also help people to understand enough about AI so that they can actually also help themselves to remain safe as they're using it. And I think if we don't address the ethical challenges involved in AI, we really will lose the potential benefits that AI can bring for education, and they're huge, and that in itself for me would be unethical. So we really do need to get frameworks, help people understand, make sure that we instill, and as Professor Koo was saying, help developers to be made accountable for what they're doing, but also help people who are going to be using the technologies to understand how to keep themselves safe too. So that's very much the focus of what I'm going to talk about. And it was very much the focus of the work that we did at the Institute for Ethical AI in Education. So I'm just going to start with a sort of an externalization of the thinking that took me towards the work that we did with the Institute. And I think it's very helpful to remember why AI has become such a popular topic of conversation at the moment, and why it's having such a huge impact on our lives, at work, leisure, and certainly on our education and training systems, not least because of the huge impact that it's having in the workplace. And that is because of the perfect storm that's come about in the last few years. That is the combination of the availability of huge amounts of data that we didn't have access to before, and it might be data from CCTV cameras, from social media, from that collected deliberately as people are interacting with technologies and are conscious of the data being collected. But in a lot of cases, people are not conscious of that data being collected. So there's huge amounts of data. And we have very sophisticated AI algorithms that can process that data and learn from that data. And then the last piece of the puzzle is that we do now have affordable computing power and memory that can store and process that data using those sophisticated algorithms. And that's what's created the perfect storm that brings about the huge advances in AI and huge advances in the impact that AI is having on the world. So I think it's important to think about those three elements: the data, the processing of the data, and the mass storage and memory that we have available to us as we think about ethics. I also think it's important to remember that whilst the phrase data is the new oil was couched, I think, originally by The Economist or the Financial Times, I'm not sure which now, and it's certainly true. There's a lot of people making a lot of money out of data, not always very ethically. But I think the thing to remember is that, of course, that data is just like oil. It's crude, it's unrefined, and it's only as we refine that data using the algorithms that that data becomes really useful to whomever is building that AI system for whatever the purpose they have for that AI system. So really, we need to think when we're considering ethics about all those elements, about the data, about the storage, about the processing, but perhaps fundamentally about the imperative for the use of artificial intelligence in any particular setting. Why is AI being used? What is the purpose for that AI? And is that purpose something that we would consider ethical? So it's extremely complex. And one of the things that we've been trying to do for a while now, and indeed it was the subject of a book I wrote in 2018 called Machine Learning and Human Intelligence, is to differentiate between artificial intelligence and human intelligence. A, because I think it's important for society that we recognize this, the sophistication of our own human intelligence and how different it is to our artificial intelligence. But also it's important from an ethical point of view to recognize the things that AI is particularly good at and how different they are from the things that humans are particularly good at. So if we think about AI, we know it's really good at pattern matching, automating and replicating, processing huge amounts of data. If we think about humans, one of the unique features of human intelligence is our capability to be meta-intelligent, to reflect upon our own thinking, our own emotions, our own contexts, to become self-effective, to be able to set goals, make judgments about whether we're likely to achieve them, make wise decisions about what we need to do in order to achieve those goals. If we need to learn something, to know how we go about learning it, who can help us, to be that kind of all-around self-aware, self-effective individual. Now, for much of artificial intelligence, which is machine learning isn't all of AI, obviously, but from a machine learning point of view, that meta level is impossible because machine learning algorithms are not self-aware, they're black boxes. And so we really need to be conscious of the differences between artificial and human intelligence. Yes, if we're going to reap the benefits from AI, but also if we're going to address ethics carefully and effectively. And so one of the ways that we've been working in parallel with the Institute for Ethical AI in Education is to devise a training program for schools, colleges, universities, educational companies, anybody involved in education, to help them understand how they can become ready for AI. And a large part of that is becoming ethically aware. And so the 7-step program that we designed has the acronym ethical. And it takes an organization through these 7 steps. The 7th one is that you iterate around again. So the 6 steps really. And that starts with educating people in the organization, for example, say it's a school, to help people feel that they want to engage with AI. We show them what benefits it can bring, to enthuse and excite them about trying to understand more about AI. And then we contextualize it, because it's my belief that for people to really understand AI in a meaningful way, it needs to be contextualized to their particular setting, their particular situation, the things that they care about. And so we take an educational challenge that's important for that particular organization, in this instance, say a school, and then we help to unpack that challenge using artificial intelligence methods. So we show the organization what AI can do to help them understand their challenges better. And in the process, we help them understand what machine learning does. They don't need to become experts at machine learning. It's just about helping them to understand what data is accessible to them, how our AI algorithm might process that data, and what you might find out through that algorithm processing the data. And it's really the first step in helping an organization to become AI ready so that they can make good decisions about where to spend their money when it comes to buying any kind of AI. It's a step before you come to making the purchase. And so we apply some AI techniques to the organization's data, and we help them to understand what their challenge can be, how they can see their challenge differently, and how they can see it through a data and an AI lens. And this is proving to be quite effective. So we've now developed it into an online training course that people can take in an educational organisation to help them understand how AI ready they are and to help them to become more AI ready. Because every step of the way, we need to be thinking about ethics. It's not something that can be added in at the last minute. It's not something that is an optional extra, as I'm afraid it has been in many computer science and AI courses over the past few decades in universities. Now it is becoming more integral. But ethics is something we need to think about right from the word go. From the moment that we're thinking about using AI or building AI, we need to start with the ethical questions that are challenging us. And so in 2018, we formed the Institute for Ethical AI in Education, and it was co-founded by my colleague Sir Anthony Selden, who's an educator in the UK, who is the only educator that I know of who's been a headmaster in a school and a vice-chancellor of a university. So has a very broad understanding of education and is also passionate about the potential that artificial intelligence brings to education. So we launched our institute in 2018 with the prime aim of coming up with a way that educational organisations could use, or a framework, as Professor Koo said, to come up with a framework that could be used by education organisations to help them make better decisions about how they were going to engage with AI. So we spent the first year doing some ground research, some desk research, looking at the kinds of frameworks that already existed. Now, we wanted ours to be very particular to education. And whilst there was a lot of work being done on data and ethics and AI and ethics, none of it was focusing specifically on education. And so part of the work that we did was to point out why AI, when applied to education, needed to be thought of in a very specific way, and why education was fundamentally important to society and warranted its own framework for ethical development and ethical application. So one of the things that we felt very strongly was that it would be wrong if educational organisations, if teachers and learners couldn't reap the benefits of AI because we hadn't come up with a way of bringing AI into education ethically. So it was very important to us that we got that message across very clearly. So in February 2020, we produced an interim report called Towards a Shared Vision of Ethical AI in Education, which was the sum of the work that we had done to date, but also a call to action, because we wanted to hold a wide-ranging consultation to listen and learn from different groups. So educators, learners, developers. And in the following year, we conducted a lot of expert interviews with policymakers, academics, philosophers, ethicists, industry experts, and educators, and then published a second report that shared the vision of where we were going to a greater extent than the first report had done, again, to try and engage in consultative activity with people. So we kept sharing what we've been doing and trying to engage people in discussion about it. So we then followed that second report with a whole series of roundtables, including 3 that were dedicated to young people and run by young people, so that we could test out some of what we were saying in that developing a shared vision for ethical AI in education. And that enabled us to take forward some of our thinking to a global summit, which had to be online, obviously, because of our current travel constraints. A global summit where we could push the boundaries a bit. We had some keynote speakers, but we had a lot of discussion sessions that tried to pick apart different elements of the report that we had produced. And then finally, in February this year, we produced our final report, and I'll run through the elements of the framework that we propose in that report in just a moment. But throughout the activity of the Institute for Ethical AI in Education, we were very lucky to be guided by an amazing advisory council. We were lucky that our activity with that advisory council was chaired by Lord Tim Clement Jones, who's been actively involved in looking at AI and is particularly concerned about AI in education. And we had an amazing group of individuals on that advisory council. And then in addition, we developed an international advisory council to make sure that we were taking into account an international perspective as we developed our framework. And so the objectives that we really wanted to achieve were to come up with a framework that we could really make accessible to educators. We had originally intended to develop a framework for educators and a separate framework for developers of AI in education. But in the end, we focused on the framework for educators, for educational organizations, to guide them through the process about making a decision about bringing AI into their organization. And that was because we felt that if we empowered the educators, then they would demand of the developers the kinds of software and applications that would enable them to meet the criteria in the framework that they were facing. So it was using and empowering the educators to demand from the developers the ethical issues to be addressed as they're developing their AI software. So it was about making those developers accountable to the educators, because we'd given the educators more understanding and a framework with which they could probe the developers and probe the particular software products that they were looking at. And we divided this framework, and it covers 4 pages. We wanted it to be a 2-page framework, but it ended up as 4 pages, so it's not hugely long. And we divided it into 8 sections that we called objectives. So we wanted to have a framework that encompassed achieving educational goals. So part of the framework looked at achieving educational goals and what kind of questions an educator should be asking in order to ensure that the way that they are applying or planning to apply AI is designed to achieve those educational goals, is focused on those educational goals. Forms of assessment was another one of the objectives: administration and workload, equity, autonomy, privacy, transparency and accountability, and informed participation, were the 8 categories or objectives that drive our ethical AI in education framework. Now, obviously, today there's not enough time to go through each of those. So what I've decided to do is I've picked one, which is transparency and accountability, to show you how we unpacked that particular objective in the framework. Because the way that we unpacked this objective in the framework is we did the same process for all of those objectives. And so if we look at transparency and accountability as an example, you can see on the one side of the screen, we have the objective, and we unpack that objective. So transparency and accountability. Humans are ultimately responsible for educational outcomes and should therefore have an appropriate level of oversight of how AI systems operate. And then you can see in brackets it says see Annex 7 for justification. So in our final report, where we published the framework, we also published the reasons, the justification, or the evidence for the design of the framework. So in order to keep the framework to a reasonable size, we added the justification to the annex. So for each point that we make, you can go to the annex and see where the evidence to support the need for this objective or the need for this criteria comes from. And it could be that it's from a round table, it could be because it's from a published document, it could be that it's come about because of several interviews that have been held. But in the report, you can see the justification and the evidence to support why this is one of the objectives that we have in the framework and why it's framed the way that it is. Because it is about giving the people who are buying the AI or procuring the AI oversight about how the AI systems operate. And then for each objective, we have a set of criteria that start to unpack the objective. So for transparency and accountability, we have 2 criteria. For some of the other objectives, there are more criteria because they're more complex. And so criteria 1, conduct a risk assessment to establish whether AI resources could undermine the authority of the practitioner and disrupt accountability structures, and take action based on the risk assessment. So the criteria are actions that the educators, the people procuring the AI, can take, conduct a risk assessment. And secondly, insist that suppliers make explicit whether there were any ability in the design of the AI resource. And we want them to specify where any compromises have been made and provide a justification. And this is a really nice example of the way that we were trying to empower the educator to hold the developers accountable by saying, ask the developer what trade-offs were made and why. And then we have a checklist. So this is a checklist to help the educator feel that they are procuring the AI appropriately. So the criteria give them some actions to do. In this example, conduct a risk assessment, insist suppliers make explicit whether they've had any trade-offs between accuracy and explainability. And then the checklist that is associated with those criteria for this particular objective starts with, will implementing the actions arising from this risk assessment ensure that the authority of the educators and or other relevant practitioners is not undermined, and that accountability structures are not disrupted as a result of using AI. And we suggest that that's the kind of thing that an educational procurer should be able to answer before they start going through the procurement of the AI. They need to think carefully about accountability and empowerment, authority within their organisation and the impact that the AI will have on that. And then the second question here, have you received the relevant information from the suppliers? So you want to know what the trade-off is between accuracy and explainability. Have they told you that? Tick or cross. Where companies have been made, compromises have been made, are you satisfied with the justification you've received? So for each of the objectives, you have your actions and you have your checklist questions. The idea being that for each procurement that you're going through, you run through the checklist of the framework for each of the objectives. And if you run through the checklist, you can feel comfortable that you have probed the potential supplier sufficiently, and you've probed the way that you are planning to apply the AI in your organisation sufficiently to feel that you can accept that the AI you're bringing in and your plans for it are ethical. However, what I would say, and what we stress is, it's not really a once kind of exercise. Yes, you need to do it at the point of procurement, but you do need to keep asking yourself some of these questions, because of course, software doesn't stay static. And so you may feel completely satisfied when you make the decision to procure an AI application, that you've been through the checklist, you've probed, you've asked the right questions, you're satisfied. But one update to that software might actually alter the answers to these questions. So we also suggested that you have an annual review when you basically go through the process on an annual basis to make sure that fundamental changes to the software have not compromised your acceptance of the original software as being something that you could accept on ethical grounds. So we encourage this annual review using the checklist for that purpose. And certainly the framework's been well received. There are various organisations looking to incorporate it into their activities. And at the moment, I'm working with an international school chain to help them see how they can apply the framework both as the procurer and the developer, which is really interesting because if you have an organisation who is both planning on developing their own particular brand of AI, which of course may involve using components that are produced by other people and then adding something yourself, and you're going to be using that within your schools, colleges, universities, whatever kind of organisation you are, then that's a very interesting challenge, because how do we make sure that as the procurer, you are probing yourself as the developer appropriately in order for you to feel comfortable that you really are addressing the core aspects of this framework? And at the moment, the way that we're tackling that is by bringing in independent experts into a steering group to help to make sure that we are both safeguarding as practitioners and delivering as developers, and that the fact that we're playing both roles is not in any way degrading the extent to which we hold ourselves accountable when it comes to ethical AI in education. So work's still ongoing. The Institute for Ethical AI in Education has concluded its work. We've produced the framework, and we're now looking to set up an organisation to help educational organisations, schools, colleges, universities, to apply that framework and to give guidance as to how the framework can be applied. Because it's not straightforward. As I said right at the start of the talk, people need to understand AI. I don't mean by that they need to be able to build the next generation of AI systems. And actually, a lot of attention in the last few years and a lot of investment has been made in ensuring that we do have young people who can build the next generation of AI systems. What's happened to a far lesser extent is to make sure that we have a population who understands enough about AI, what it can do, what it can't do, and how it operates without needing that technical understanding in order to be able to use that AI effectively and ethically. So for me, it's all about education. Yes, we want to use AI in education, but we have to help people understand AI. And we need to give them tools such as this framework, such as our 7-step process for AI readiness, in order to help them understand AI enough to be able to safeguard themselves. Whilst, yes, we have to have that strong regulation, but we can't have everyone feeling secure and safe merely because of the existence of that regulation, because it will never be enough on its own. So we have to do this education, and we have to provide educators with tools. Thank you very much for listening. I hope that's been useful. I'm very happy to talk more about the AI readiness programme of training or the framework from the Institute for Ethical AI and Ed at any point in the panel or through questions. Thank you very much for listening.